North Korea appears to be stepping back from their threats to attack Guam, just days after promising to rain an enveloping ring of fire around the U.S. territory. New pictures purportedly show the regime's military leaders briefing Kim Jong Un on the attack plans to launch 4 missiles simultaneously towards the territory. But state media reports say that Un has, quote, opted to not fire the missiles at this time. Pyongyang's news agency says Kim decided he would, quote, watch a little more of the foolish and stupid conduct of the Yankees, end quote. The backtracking came after Secretary of Defense James Mattis warned North Korea it would be, quote, game on if the regime fired missiles at Guam. Anthony Ruggiero is a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, joining me from Washington to get into the North Korea issue a bit more. Anthony, are we seeing now a de-escalation of tensions?
Well, it looks like North Korea is definitely pulling back from some of their threats to attack Guam. I think Secretary Mattis's comments were appropriate. I think the North Koreans have not really seen the credible use of military force. I mean, only 7 years ago, the North Koreans sunk a South Korean naval vessel and really found no punishment for that. So I think the North Koreans really have to understand there are consequences to their actions.
So is the tough rhetoric that's coming out of President Trump and other administration officials working, or do you think a back-channel diplomacy is at play here?
Well, I think they're using all elements of American power. There's back-channel diplomacy, there's the threat of future sanctions against North Korea and China, and frankly against some of our own allies that are still working with North Korea. And there's the credible use of military force. Not only did the president send 2 aircraft carriers earlier this year, but had the strike against Syria as well for the use of WMD. So I think North Korea is getting the right message here. Now,
beyond that, Joint Chief of Staff Joseph Dunford has said that a full range of contingency plans have been drawn up. Let me ask you this. Are there targeted military options? I mean, you mentioned Syria. That was a targeted strike. When it comes to stopping Kim Jong Un's nuclear march, is there a targeted military option, or are we looking at the potential for all-out war if the U.S. takes that route?
Well, the problem with military strikes against North Korea, even a targeted one, perhaps, the one that's mentioned the most often is, taking out a missile as it's being fueled. The issue here is how will Kim Jong Un react to that? There's no guarantee that he won't see that as a military attack against his entire country and that he'll respond. And so you get all the disadvantages of a full-out war with none of the real advantages because you're just taking out one missile.
Yeah, 50 miles from Seoul, that border with all that artillery with the North. All right, let's talk about sanctions. I know this is your expertise. This week, China began implementing the sanctions that the UN Security Council imposed on North Korea. And you tweeted, overall, the UNSC resolution does not advance U.S. policy and is counterproductive. Why do you think so?
Well, I think if we're going to have a replay of what we've seen over the last 23 years, then it is counterproductive. China, I think China has gotten the benefit of just issuing an order. They have not yet started to pull back on these sanctions. The order says it won't go into effect until September 5th. And this is the Chinese game. When the spotlight is the brightest, they are the #1 in implementing sanctions. But when people go away from that and the spotlight fades, they continue their relationship with North Korea. So the question here is this a new era with China, which I'm not convinced it is yet? Or is it just the Chinese slow rolling us so they can avoid U.S. sanctions?
Okay, so which sanctions would have an impact and why aren't they being discussed and used?
Well, I mean, the name of the game is China. Chinese companies, individuals, and banks are engaging and facilitating North Korea's sanctions evasion, and we haven't gone after enough of them. And so the Trump administration really needs to move up the escalation ladder. We're at the bottom rung right now. We need to get tougher on China. Even if they implement this resolution, it still won't be enough. The Chinese are providing other avenues for North Korea to continue its sanctions evasion.
I want to take a different tack on this that hasn't been discussed a lot. Little has been said about the North Korean people and the conditions they're living in as their leader spends massive amounts of the country's money on his nuclear weapons program. How do human rights factor into all of this? How should they factor into all of this?
Well, they should factor in, they have political prison camps where 100,000 or more of his own citizens are subjected to torture. Every day, North Korean citizens don't have the same basic human rights that most Americans have. They're starving. They're in other situations that are really terrible. And I think you're right. You know, when you point out the nuclear weapons program, the two other places I would point out that they spend their money is luxury goods for their elites and for the military. And so the issue here is the more we strangle that revenue, the more he'll have to make those decisions. And I think that this is the part that's not discussed, is how do we get information into the North Korean people to make clear that what they're living under is not a normal regime, and that we could start to precipitate some kind of change internally.
Anthony Ruggiero in Washington, thanks for your insights.
Thank you.